This is the fourth part of the video series called God's Covenants, and in this video I will be dealing with the covenant that God made with Moses and also the covenant that God made with David. We'll just delve into the content of the covenants and also the purpose and some details or aspects about the covenants themselves. In the last three videos, we've been having a look at the covenant that God made with Abraham, and we extended that a lot further by discussing the faith stream that we believe started with the call of Abraham when God said, "Get out of your country." And we had a look at a parallel of how the entire faith stream was also removed out from the unbelieving mankind. And that faith stream became the believing mankind that was made up of the two people groups. So we went into a lot of detail about the Abrahamic covenant and also had a look at all these aspects with regard to the two people groups, the destinations of the people groups, etc. So, taking this journey up the timeline, we have the first person of Abraham that God made the covenant with, but he also confirmed the covenant with Isaac and also with Jacob. And we know, of course, that Jacob had 12 sons. One of the 12 sons was Joseph, who was then sold into slavery by his brothers, and Joseph ended up in Egypt. So it's a long journey. It's a lot of history that has taken place since God called Abraham. And Joseph, of course, became the second in charge in Egypt. His brothers, because of a famine, came into Egypt, and Joseph was able to rescue them and provide them all their needs there in Egypt. About 430 years passed, and of course, Israel, who was not a nation yet, they were really just slaves in Egypt. But through that growth of the Jew as such within Israel, it eventually came to the point of the great Exodus, where God raised up Moses and through the account with Moses got them out of Egypt through the Red Sea, and eventually they came to the Mount Sinai, where God made another covenant with Moses over the nation of Israel. And it's actually here at this point that I'd like to pick up on the covenant that God made with Moses, the covenant of law, and we're going to delve into this and have a look at this in a little bit more detail. It is at this point that we are now in our account with Israel. They are all encamped around Mount Sinai, and God has called Moses up the mountain. And it's at this point now where Moses receives the Ten Commandments, the covenant that God makes with Israel. This, very interestingly, is a conditional covenant. We, through the book of Exodus and Leviticus, we learn how the covenant is conditional in the sense that if they obey, they will be blessed. And if they do not obey, they will be cursed. But the covenant itself is the covenant of law through the Ten Commandments, and there is a certain purpose to this covenant that I'd like to just delve into at this point of time. So if we have a look at Exodus chapter 19 from verse 5, it's this verse and also verse 6 that gives us the essence, in my opinion, of the actual covenant of law God gave to Moses. And it reads the following: "Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people." That is, of course, a reference to the nations. Now, just hear that out. If they obey and keep the covenant, then God is saying to this nation that is encamped around Mount Sinai at this point of time, that they should be a special treasure above all other people on the face of the earth. We hear this a lot in various scriptures, which we will encounter further down the line in this video series. But a very interesting point that God makes with regard to a special treasure. It continues, therefore, and it says, "For all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Now, I want to mention here, right now at this point, that Israel, of course, as we know, were not able to keep these covenants, to keep these commandments. And they, of course, failed in many aspects. And therefore, at this point of time, we cannot say that they are a kingdom of priests, neither a holy nation. But what we can say for sure is that one of Abraham's descendants, the one called Jesus Christ, he was the one that kept the law to the perfect degree. And it is Jesus Christ himself that actually fulfilled this particular covenant. And through his perfect life, through his fulfillment of prophecy, he became the one through whom the blessing would come, that they would become this kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Now, this kingdom of priests and holy nation is actually something that will certainly be fulfilled, but only in the millennial kingdom, only in that kingdom when Jesus comes at his second coming to take ownership and rule as King of kings and Lord of lords. And he will be the King of Israel and will be that benevolent dictator that will rule the nations with an iron rod. And it's at that time that the nation of Israel, those saved Jews, those physical Jews that walk into the kingdom with the Lord, will become that kingdom of priests who will take his word and his salvation out to the nations. This is also, of course, when they will be that holy nation, because they will be preeminent above all the nations of the world at that time. So we do see in Exodus 19 through to chapters 24 and also in Deuteronomy 11 that this covenant was a conditional covenant made with Israel. So the last thing I'd like to mention here about the covenant is that the purpose of the covenant was simply to set Israel apart. As we see in the actual covenant itself, "You shall be a special treasure to me above all other people groups or nations." So the purpose of the covenant was to set Israel apart, but also to give them that status of God's chosen people, which is significant because it is God's promises to this chosen people that they themselves would become this kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God has a purpose for them right throughout history, and even though they failed in many aspects, if we look back at the history of Israel through the Old Testament, their purpose was secure because of Jesus Christ, because he ultimately would become that perfect Jew who would keep all these commandments. And it's through Jesus that the nation of Israel will inherit the status and the preeminence and the kingdom, which was promised, of course, to David in the next covenant. As I mentioned in our previous slide, the purpose of the law was to establish Israel. It's my personal opinion that when God gave Moses the Ten Commandments and he brought them down the Mount of Sinai and presented them to Israel, it is at that point that Israel became Israel. In other words, they were just a people or a number of slaves. But after their trek through the Red Sea and into the wilderness, when Moses gave those Ten Commandments, that is where Israel was born. But the purpose, besides the identity of Israel, it was also to bring out God's glory through them. Israel was always going to be the nation who would show forth God's glory. And it's not just through the mighty signs and miracles that the nation saw through Israel, but it was also just the fact that God's hand was on them, and He gave them His word. The law at that time was His word. The law at that time was part of the salvation of Israel. So there was always this aspect that Israel carried the Lord's presence in the earth, and the law was that part of their identity, that other nations would see that Israel was special, that Israel was more esteemed, that Israel's God was alive. So if we have a look at the verses that I have on the slide here, it brings this purpose out. It shows it a little bit more clearly. And the Lord said to Moses, I will give you, that is Moses, tablets of stone and a law and commandments that you may teach Israel. All right. In other words, the Lord was saying these laws must be taught to Israel. Israel must know these laws backwards and forwards, because this would become their status quo, how the other nations would identify and see Israel. So there's a very interesting verse here in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 5, or from verse 5. It reads, Behold, I, that is a reference to Moses, have taught you statutes and judgments, even as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do so in the land which you go to possess. Keep therefore and do them, for this, now take note of what I've been saying here. Here's the verse. For this is your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of all the nations, which shall hear all these statutes and say, Surely this great nation, a reference to Israel, is a wise and understanding people. And then it continues in verse 7, For what nation is there so great, who has God so near unto them as the Lord our God is, in all the things that we call upon him for? And what nation is there so great that has statutes and judgments so righteous as all this law which I set before you today? So in these verses, we see clearly that the law and the statutes that were given to Israel were for their wisdom, were for the fact that the nations out there, the Gentile nations, would see that this is a wise and understanding nation, and that they are righteous in all their law. So this is the purpose for the law initially at this point of time in the timeline for Israel. It was there to prepare Israel. In actual fact, that's another point that I'd like to just bring out here, is the fact that the law was going to prepare Israel to receive their king. It was preparing them mentally and within their heart to know what was right from wrong, to give an understanding of this kingdom that was going to come, because the kingdom itself would be run by the law and by the statutes and by the ordinances that were put into place. One last thing that I want to mention with regard to the law covenant that was given by God to Moses and at that time to Israel is something that might surprise some of you. Please note, the law was never given to the Gentile nations. It was never given to the Gentiles to be a way of life. Now, I'm not just referring to the Gentiles at that time in the Old Testament. I'm referring even to today. So many believe that we have to try and live a good life by living the law, by living the Ten Commandments, by living under a law-based or a performance-based program. And this is not the case, right? You and I, as sinful men and women, cannot live the law. We have no capacity to even attain to even one command of the law. And we will hear about this in much greater detail when we get into Paul's doctrine, right, which says that we are not under law, but under grace. So that is something that I'd like to just draw your attention to, even at this point where we are talking about the law given to Israel. So if we just have a look at the content on the slide, sinful man could never keep the law in their own strength, for by the law is the knowledge of sin, which Romans 3 verse 19 and 20 says. So it is typically by the law that you know what is right and wrong. And just the fact that the knowledge is there will cause you to sin. Um, the law served as a schoolmaster to lead Israel to Christ. The scripture, but before faith came, we were kept under God by law. Now, let me just read that again and just give some clarity here. Just notice what this verse says in Galatians chapter 3 from verse 24. But before faith came. Now, that faith that we're referring to there is Christ. As we read on in the verse, you will see it gets clear. We, as a reference to Israel, were kept under God by the law, kept for the faith which would afterwards be revealed. That is, again, when Jesus would be born and go into his earthly ministry. Therefore, the law has become our tutor to lead us. Now, that us is not you and I, that us is a reference to Israel. This is Israel before the faith was revealed, before Jesus Christ came. It's Paul is writing here, therefore the law has become our tutor to lead us as the nation of Israel to Christ, so that we, again the nation of Israel, may be justified by faith. So again, please note that this verse here is referring to that the law was given to Israel. The law was given as a tutor, as a guide to bring Israel to Christ. And then when Christ came, when that faith came, they would then be justified by that faith. So notice, not justified by the law. The law has no power to save. Not us today, not Israel at that time. It was simply there to lead Israel to Christ. And when Christ came, they would then recognize their Messiah, have faith in their Messiah, and through his actions, through the actions of Jesus Christ, through his fulfillment of the law and the prophets, they would come into right standing with God. So again, I say, the law is not for you and I. The law was given to Israel as a tutor, as a guide to bring them to Christ. You and I today do not stand under the law. We will get into details with Paul's teachings with regard to how we live by faith, how we are not under the law, how we are dead to law and dead to sin in that regard, because we have a whole new faith system because of the work of Jesus Christ, his cross work for us. And that we will learn in videos that come up in the future. God made 4 covenants with the nation of Israel. The first being the Abrahamic covenant, which covered land and a people or a nation and blessing. And then came the covenant that God gave to Moses, which was a covenant of law or governance, if I could say that. But the law also gave identity to Israel and allowed nations, the Gentile nations at that time on earth, to see that the God of Israel was the God, that there was salvation and that there was life in the God of Israel. So that was the identity, the law that made Israel different from all other nations on earth, that made them that chosen generation, and eventually that would cause them to be that kingdom of priests and that holy nation which was out there in the future in the millennial kingdom. We now get to the covenant that God made with David. And this covenant continues to build on the blessing of Israel, or the purpose of Israel. So we know that there was land. We know that there was a nation that was born out of the seed of Abraham. We know of the purpose of the law to train Israel, to show Israel as different. And now with the covenant that God makes with David, he adds this blessing upon Israel with regard to a throne and with regard to an eternal kingdom, and of course a king that would come through the lineage of David. So we see the essence again of this third covenant that God makes with Israel in 2 Samuel chapter 7 verse 12, or from verse 12. And it reads the following: when your days are fulfilled, now this is speaking about David, and you rest with your fathers, I will set up your seed after you. In other words, that being a reference to Solomon, David's son, who would come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. The covenant continues, bringing its focus back onto David again by saying, and your house, that is David, your house and your kingdom shall be established forever before you. Your throne shall be established forever. So let's now have a look at the various key words that come out of this covenant that God sets up with David. We hear the word house. Now this house is a dynasty or a bloodline in the lineage of David. So for instance, today you would hear of the House of Windsor, if you think in terms of the royal family in the UK. Right? So that is a reference, therefore, to the lineage of David, that this house or this dynasty is going to be set up and become meaningful for when, of course, Jesus comes in this particular lineage of David. Then we have the word kingdom, which is referring to a people or a people group that would be governed by a king. That's the purpose for that word kingdom. The word throne is emphasizing the authority of the king's rule. Right? This is, of course, where the covenant reads, your throne will be established forever. So that authority of the king, when Jesus sits on the throne in that millennial kingdom, and of course into eternity, because it's an eternal kingdom, his authority and rule is going to be set based on his throne. And then we, of course, have the word forever, which is emphasizing the eternal and unconditional nature of this particular promise that God makes to David. We know that this kingdom is going to be an eternal kingdom. Jesus Christ will be ruling as King of Kings and Lord of Lords into all of eternity. There's not much more that I need to say about the Davidic covenant. So I'm just going to round it off with this particular slide and then give you some aspects about the fourth covenant, of course, which was brought about by Jesus Christ himself, the new covenant. So we have, of course, these four covenants that were made with Israel. The Davidic one being an unconditional covenant, which is regarding the eternal kingdom and a throne and a king that will reign forever. So God promised that David's lineage and kingdom would last forever. The promise of his house and kingdom and throne will be established forever is significant, as it shows that the Messiah will come from the lineage of David and that he will establish a kingdom from which he will reign. Now that, of course, is confirmed in the very first verse of the first chapter of Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, where we actually read the book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, and of course the son of Abraham. So you'll see how interesting that very first verse in the New Testament reads, how it brings connection with the covenant that God made with David, which is unconditional. In other words, no man can break that covenant. It is a covenant that God made through himself, and that would certainly come to a conclusion in the future. And then, of course, it references the covenant that God made with Abram, which also is an unconditional covenant. God cut that covenant while Abraham was asleep, and that covenant will certainly be fulfilled also in and through the millennial kingdom and the reign of Jesus Christ in that kingdom. All right, so of course the covenant that God made with Moses was conditional because that was dependent on Israel's obedience to the covenant itself. And we know, of course, that Israel failed in that Old Testament period of time. But the covenant, however, was kept through Jesus Christ because of his sinless life and because he fulfilled all of the law and the prophets at that time. And Israel's blessing comes out of that life that Jesus lived. All right, so I'm going to conclude this video. What I do want to mention is the video coming up after this one. We're going to look into the covenant that Jesus set up, the new covenant, and have a look at the purpose of that covenant, the content of that covenant, and the value of that covenant, how it plays a role over Israel, and also what it's going to do for them in that millennial kingdom when that covenant itself also gets fulfilled.